I'm curious if there are organizations that are starting to realize that this is an investment. So like, for example, if you have pay inequity and you fix that inequity, should you do back pay too? Because that is a way to restore. Could you do things like that? So I'm just curious if there's organizations that are thinking more about restoration and recognizing that the organization has a role to play in that type of investment.
I'm hoping that there's someone here who has an optimistic answer. Because my pessimistic answer is that, let's just be honest. For an organization to be talking about restoration, they need to understand that as an organization they've done harm, and that structurally and systemically that harm has occurred. That people of color, indigenous people, and black people bring into that organization. It takes so much time to even get that in the room in a way that people aren't freaking out, crying in a corner, angry, and able to have a conversation that isn't over-intellectualized. That I want to have a discussion about liberation and restoration. But before, and not just a conversation, but like, let's really strategically think about that. But before, to do that, it means that not only do we have to unearth that, do I as the consultant have to somehow hold the space for all of that in a series of trainings or coaching or whatever modality we're using, and then there has to be a case made like this is important to do. And I'm going to be honest, I don't know that many organizations that are there yet, because the level of emotion that shows up, even amongst those of us who think about this all day, every day, the level of emotion that shows up in doing this work prevents us from getting to that type of conversation. So my pessimistic answer is no, because I haven't seen it. But if they are there, please tell us, who are they? Because I can tell you there's about 15 consultants I know who literally want to study them and take all of, deconstruct and then figure out how we can reconstruct it. So.
I would just shout out the work of Arabella Perez. She works nationally on trauma-informed care, and she's been developing some workshops around organizational healing and helping move organizations through restorative processes. And I've just been loving her work. So that's Arabella Perez out of UNE.
Good afternoon. Thank you for this segment, first of all. It's a great deal of rich information, very helpful. My name is Henry Posco. I lead an organization called Humanum, about 600 employees. We've been in the equity space for about 9 years. The first 4 were a real struggle. I have a comment and then a question around communication and change management. And during those first 4 years when we started, there were a lot of stops and starts. We thought we were heading in the right direction. We stopped for a while, we regrouped, formed an inclusiveness committee, stopped that, went back to it again. Not until we did a racial equity assessment of the entire organization did we feel like we began to move things. One of the things I wish I had done, which I do with strategic planning and other things, is I wish I had communicated to the organization why we were changing, why we were moving in this direction. So if you look at the typical traditional change formula, I would typically say, the status quo doesn't work, here's why it doesn't work, here's what our vision is, and these are the steps to get there. I didn't do that with this. My question is, have you encountered that, because it's a great way to overcome resistance, and are there other things that you can do to articulate and communicate to the masses that are going to go through this change, whether it's having an advocacy group, getting short-term wins, etc. but how we communicate that change, because I think that resistance happens when we're not clear on why we're doing what we're doing.
Thank you so much, Henry. In my perspective, that's where you start. An organization has to be able to understand, what does diversity, equity, inclusion, what does race, equity mean to our work and our mission? And what is ours to do? And what do we value about that? And how is that showing up? And how do we want that to influence our programs, how we operate as staff, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so one of the first steps for me in working with the organization, and I kind of have like two layers. There's the work and there's the learning, which I'll speak to in just a moment. But one of the very first steps in the work is being able to articulate exactly that. Like, what does this mean to our mission? And then begin to map. If that's the case, well, what does success look like if we're doing that really well? When it comes to our staff, when it comes to our board, when it comes to our programs and services, and where are we at now? And then our work is, how do we map where we are now to get to what success looks like? The other piece I would say that has to run concurrently is just the learning, because the work can help with the institutional changes that need to happen. But if individuals aren't growing, if we're not doing our own personal work, if our mindset, our worldview is not changing, then when we're inherently continually bringing our own bias, our own ignorance, that's not going to address the root causes, that are not going to get us to what success looks like. And so having a continuous learning plan at all levels of the organization is extremely important for individuals to build their own capacity, to be able to see how they're showing up, be able to see how others are showing up, be able to have the tools to be able to not call people out, but call people in, as we're all trying to collectively move towards change.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add in terms of our approach in entering an organization is we really specifically work with the senior team or the leadership team, as well as that equity leadership team that's been talked about so much, cross-functional, representing different identities. Those are the two teams we're working with prior to really having any real contact with the staff. We're building their capacity, we're building their knowledge and skills, we're building their relationship within the team. But then the second piece of that is bringing those two teams together to build their relationship with each other. Both of them are holding this container, this ecosystem to guide this process. They both have different work to do, and they both have the same work to do in terms of messaging, in terms of being keeping it on folks' radar screen and figuring out how to support. We always have like a buddy system or something, so staff have touch points throughout the process and have that support in a place to call to go through it. And I think also in terms of one of the things I know that comes up is sometimes, senior leaders are not ready to take this on. Their egos can get pinched as we start moving and transforming the culture of the organization. So we spend a lot of time also coaching that leadership team, and for some it's weekly, and for others it's monthly. But it's important for that leadership team to be able to articulate and talk about racial equity and begin making their case for the organization.
And I just want to add in, I think there are 2 or 3 elements of change management that have kind of gotten lost in the wash. When we try to think about equity or inclusion or racial justice work as how are we going to transform our processes, we've already kind of missed the boat. It's not about transforming processes. Processes have a life of their own, and the life they take depends on the quality of relationship within that organization. So what we're really trying to do is transform the quality of a relationship so that processes can make the impact we need to make. And so the 2 parts of change management that I think get lost in the wash is, 1, change management communications is not about what we say. It's, do we have feedback loops and systems for processing what we are hearing? What are our skills for listening, making sense and meaning of what we're hearing, and then continuing the story sharing systematically? So one of the first things I ask people is, how are your internal communication systems? And they kind of look at me like, what? That's not what I called you here to talk about. The second thing that I think gets lost is change management at its heart is about helping people process emotions. So we have to talk about grief. We have to talk about letting go, just as much as we talk about what we want to become. And this is where I think we need to nuance, and I want to tie into the last question, we need to nuance the conversation around self-care. I love this bucket of self-care over here. When I'm in that bucket, what I miss is how am I processing my energy. What I realized for a long time in my career was I was doing self-care things. I was eating my chocolate, I was watching my Netflix, I was hanging out with my friends, I was going out for drinks. I was like checking the box on, I am living a good Instagram life right now. And my husband was like, you are still very angry, Nicola. I was like, yeah, I'm still angry. And what I realized was those things that I had called self-care were not actually the things that were going to let me process my emotions. And for some, those are the things that help them process their emotions. So it's not to diss on those things, but it's to, in a change management process, be telling the difference between where am I recharging my battery and where am I kind of contracting to allow for the process of emotion. There's expanding. When we expand to process emotion, we're putting out energy to move the processing of grief. We also need to contract and just be quiet or be in a home space where that energy can move. And so I would just add that into how do you create a successful change management project. We need to bring those things in.
One thing I would just share from a conversation, I have colleagues recently in the Race Equity and Philanthropy Fund, and Carly here of Change Philanthropy was part of this conversation. And organizations need to do a better job of holding space for what Nicola just described. And implicit in the race equity cycle, which is an organizational framework, is the work of healing, which is generally unnamed. But what we inflict on one another through microaggressions and what happens in check-ins and in the hallways and in the culture that we create or perform together is reenacting our trauma. And unless we, as humans, as well as leaders within an organization, recognize that there needs to be a space for that within this work, we are going to remain a little bit stuck. And as you go forward, you go back, you go to the side. I think as Michael said earlier, like this is not a linear process, but hopefully there will be an increasing focus on holding this space in order to advance our ability to operationalize equity. Because what many folks within the Race Equity and Philanthropy Fund are experiencing as leaders of projects that focus on race equity is a lack of space where they can receive support to actually execute the work as humans. And we don't talk enough about this. And I have had some conversations with colleagues and consultants, and similar to what Erica said, the need for this space is often dismissed as soft and weak and unnecessary. And what you are living in change management, and in this world of internalized racism and oppression generally, in which we occupy, is embodied trauma. And that needs to be named, and we don't know the way through that necessarily, but we're working on it.
Hi, my question is, as consultants, what has been your approach towards working across generations, and what have you found successful in creating alignment?
So I'm going to sort of work my way through this answer, thinking out loud here. So part of what I've encountered in doing inclusion and equity work specifically, and looking at race and taking in generational differences, is that there is this level of impatience on both coming from every generation involved. And to be very honest, what I see is that, and if, I'm going to not stereotype, perhaps generalize here. I see younger staffers who are like, why aren't we here already? I don't want to talk about it. Why aren't we talking about this? Why aren't we talking about intersectionality? Why aren't we talking about any number of more sophisticated terms and occurrences? And what I see happening, I'm a Gen Xer, and baby boomers, is sometimes what I see happening generationally is, well, hold on, I want to talk about this term of race and racism, and I always heard that race and racism had to do with the Ku Klux Klan, and now you're telling me that there's this 4 levels, and hold on, I'm now figuring out that this has happened, and have I perpetrated this? And so there's inside of an organization, what I see happening is just sort of not permanent butting of heads, but occasionally bumping up against each other. And so part of the way of dealing with that has been to actually name that that's what's occurring. And to say, I know that there are people in this room who are really irritated that we're not moving faster. And I know that there are people in this room and in this work who are really irritated that we're moving as fast as we are. And I know that there are people who would like to stay where we are because they benefit from it. And guess what? No one's going to be happy at the end of this. And the cause is for the greater good, which is what you have paid me to help you get to. So my own approach is name the thing, put it inside the room, acknowledge that people may have feelings and that we're going to bump up against each other, and then to say, can we show each other a little bit of grace? Can we show up and can I show you, not inexhaustible grace, yes, but can I show you a little bit, can we show each other a little bit of grace? That none of us are going to get this right, and we're not going to move as fast as we want, and we're not going to move as slow as we want. So let's just have a little bit of grace with each other, and let's continue moving forward.
This one hits really close to home for me, so I'd love to speak a little bit about it, because I both live in one of the oldest states in the country, and in my city, our average age is 35. And that's because we've got a lot of young families of color. And one of the conversations we've been starting to develop in a lot of our work is this concept that we're in a moment where there are massive generations of people that actually are living different realities. And this really hit home for me when I was working with a social justice leader in my community who was an elderly gentleman, and he had tension and a conflict with a younger woman of color. And we really talked through their different realities, that there are different worlds in operation. And so really thinking about age as a line of difference that deserves time to understand each other's reality and honor each other's reality instead of trying to convince each other we're right. Say, those old people don't know what they're talking about. Those young people don't know what they're talking about. It's not, you both are touching different parts of the elephant in the dark. And sometimes I have to do that as a workshop or as a series of learnings for a group to go into the next phase of learning. I will say one other thing I want to know. I'm noticing a lot more participants in meetings say they think this work is important because their kids in college are now talking to them about it. And the more we treat family like not work, the more we're losing some of these rich conversations that are happening in homes intergenerationally. And I want to think about how can we leverage those intergenerational experiences of family more in our work. The other thing I've had to really lean into is mapping what I think about different arcs of racial identity development with age. That's a really tough thing to hold. Because there have been people in my life that I want to be my mentor, that I want to kind of be the holder of my flashlight. And I realize where they're at in their journey is I've had the privilege and the experience of some aspects of freedom that they haven't had yet in their own identity development work. And so I have to kind of bring some of that into our conversations and into my own awareness as I'm seeking advice from others. 2 little things I put in your back pocket to Google. One is the book My Grandmother's Hands, right? Lots of nods. It's a really interesting meditation both on interracial trauma and also intergenerational. And then I'm not going to remember her full name, and I'm totally trying to remember her full name. But I think it was Pauline Gibbs, and the title of the episode is A Breathing Chorus from How to Survive the End of the World, which is a podcast. So How to Survive the End of the World. She talks about how we do intergenerational time travel and pull on the healing from past generations and offer healing to future generations. And it just puts a much more positive spin on this question of how are we organizing intergenerationally.
I just want to first say thank you all for everything you've been sharing this afternoon. From the speakers this morning, Whitney really set it up nicely, and there's so many good connections. I have so many questions, but I just want to ask 2, and what I would really love if we have time, I would love for each of the panelists to answer one of these 2, if there's time and if that's okay. So, one question is, I work in the ed sector, and in my work, I get opportunities to work with state education agencies and school districts. And as many people know in the ed sector, equity became sexy in 2015 when ESSA got signed in, right? Like, I don't know if that resonates with you. I feel like all of a sudden ESSA got signed and we started talking about equity, and then everybody started talking about equity. And now it's this thing, right? It's this noun. Oh, our equity work, the equity space. And what I often pause and wait for is like, when does it become a verb? And it's the work part of the framework, right? And I often am in these meetings and I'm questioning people. What do you mean when you say we're advancing equity? Like, what is that? I don't think it's fair to say we have a shared definition of that. And I appreciate the framework because it calls it out right in the first page. But I'm curious, the first question is, I'm curious in your work, what are your experiences? If you have stories about your work with folks that have hired you to move them from talking about equity as this generic thing and that process for like getting to what it is we mean when we say equity in our work. The second thing is that I've also noticed when equity became sexy and people started looking for the equity consultants, right? The number of vendors and consultants, it just like quadrupled, like exponentially. We had so many people were throwing equity on their resumes, and because nobody knew, like we talked about in the beginning, what they were looking for, it was like, oh, this person's got all this equity. Like, again, like it's so nebulous. Like, what is that? And I have come to appreciate in my own studies and work that this is a skill set. This is no different than when we want a math teacher, we make sure they know mathematics, right? Like there's a skill set, there's a content, there's a preparation. So I'm just sort of curious to hear your, again, insights and perspectives about, as consultants who are experts in this work, what have your experiences been like working and meeting? I'm sure you've met lots of other folks who claim to be equity consultants and experts, right? And so what are some stories or experiences, or even your thoughts or reflections on what I've just posed?
I just want to start for a second because it's 3:26, and I know Andrew is trying to keep us on time. So I'm going to ask for your grace and let us go to 3:35, and then Erica, if you could start, and then we can go down the line, and each of you could respond to one or the other question.
Sure. So I'm going to pick number 1 because number 2, my immediate reaction is none of us want to be placed in a situation to talk about possible family. So and that's just me. So I think the first piece around even using equity as a noun is really my background is that I have a law degree. And so when you are in law school, what a word means can determine a case. So I always start with, what does equity mean? And in the context of doing social, and to flip it and say, the purpose of equity work is to address systemic inequities. So first let's identify what the inequities are, and then figure out how we can make it more equitable. So like you have to deconstruct to put it back together. The other thing that I say around equity work is that if you're not thinking about this as justice work, because it's justice work. And I do that sometimes as a litmus test to organizations to see how they're gonna, are they gonna sort of draw back and be like, oh, we're not trying to do any social justice work up in here. It's not tied to our mission. Or are they going, oh, let me lean in, like, yes, we want to do social justice work as it pertains to our mission. But I will say that to clients, like, when we're talking about equity work specifically, this is justice. And that means that sometimes not only is it going to be messy, not only is it going to be hard, not only is it going to be painful, but in some ways you might have to think of yourself as a revolutionary. You might be one of the first to do it. And so, get your mind right. To consider if you're willing to go into the arena or whatever, sort of metaphor you want to think about it. But that equity work, that it requires pushing forward, not just nudging, pushing forward. And so, as we think about doing that work, or as I think about doing that work with organizations, I need to make sure, like, are you in this? Are we in it to win it? Then let's go.
And I want to thank Tamika and Maggie for the grace to go before I have to hop off. I was doing a lot of head nodding to what you shared, Erica. I was just like, yes, because I have this anxiety that sometimes I think the word equity, even though I use it in my work because I'm trying to meet people where they're at, is a way of saying we don't want to do justice or we don't want to do freedom work. So thank you for sharing that. When I started up with community, I was kind of like wide-eyed and maybe naive, and I went around saying to people, I want to do liberation work. I want to help build liberatory organizations. And I started to have the sneaking suspicion that a lot of folks I was talking to didn't actually believe that we can be free. And then I started saying to people, I'm an organizational development consultant. I do organizational development. And then I was like, no, that's not really what I do. I really want to help people be free. And it's really taken kind of 7 years to kind of figure out how to invite people into a conversation about freedom that doesn't scare them off from the get, and also allows people to enter into it wherever they want to enter into it. And I think we do have to keep asking these questions of, can you do equity without justice? Can you achieve your mission without justice? Why is justice so scary? What is freedom? Not the big Merriam-Webster dictionary definition of freedom, but just how would you describe to your 5-year-old niece, nephew, cousin, grandchild what it means to be free? Because we should be able to say that in whatever language it is for our community. And the fact that we weren't asked to do that when we were 5 years old ourselves is a part of the inequity we're trying to fix.
I have to ask you this.
I'm gonna stop right there.
Because I see Andrew giving me the gaze from the back.
Thank you, guys.
Maggie, Tamika, if you could give like a 30 to 45 second response, and then we're going to wrap and let them begin to restructure the room.
So to answer your question directly, most of the organizations who come and say they want to do equity work are not ready to do equity work, just in my experience. I also say, but with that said, I don't necessarily think that doesn't mean they can't aspirationally set that as a goal. So then my role then becomes, how do I help them understand what that work really means? how that work is tied to their mission, and what it's going to take to really do that, and knowing that that's going to take more than a one-year strategy.
And very quickly, I'm going to take on the second question because I think, there has been so many folks who have popped up and put out their placard that they're now doing equity work. And the first question is just how are they addressing power? How are they addressing shifting ownership? If that's not the conversation. The second piece is for folks, and I know there's lots of consultants in the room, we need to be in community with each other. Yes. We need to be able to call each other in. If we're hearing stuff that things happen, we have to keep each other accountable. I always ask my clients now is we need a handoff call. If you were working with somebody before, I need you to set that up because I need to be talking to the other person because we need to make sure we're holding you and we're being thoughtful in how we're supporting you. So let's create this community. Let's be accountable.
Thank you to each of you and Nicola in absence for your brilliance and for sharing your expertise and wisdom with us today. I just have a few announcements. One is that for those of you who want to participate in the blanket exercise, which is going to happen at the back of this room, the cap on participation is 40. So if you would like to participate, we'd ask that you go back and speak to one of the facilitators to hold your spot before leaving the room. We're having a reception at the end of the day, and we invite you all to stay and have some drinks with us after this equity party. For those of you who are attending the Racial Equity Institute training tomorrow, check-in will start here at 8:15. We will also be emailing you a survey after today's events, and we would ask that you complete it as it's very helpful for our work, and in particular because Equity in the Center needs to chart its path for sustainability, and so your feedback on our impact is particularly critical at this point in time. If you complete the survey, you will be entered in a raffle to get free registration at our convening on November 12th in Chicago. And thank you all for coming, and again to our panelists for their expertise.